Thank you very much for coming. Isn't it been a good day? Decent way to spend your Saturday, rather than pushing a trolley around IKEA, buying coat hangers and tea lights and all of those things. This is good. I'm standing between you and the craft beer event, which, as somebody that doesn't drink, my talk will probably be about 4.5 hours. So if you want to get one in right now. I've got a confession to make. A few years ago, my interest in designing for the web completely waned. I just lost interest in what I was seeing, and I really felt like web design had stagnated, that we somehow had replaced creativity with trying to make things predictable, and that somehow ideas were less important than data or research or all of these other terribly boring things. I think I need to change the title, sorry. There we go, right now. We all know this isn't going to end well, just like when Jerry Halliwell left the Spice Girls. Now, when I began to work on some projects with a legendary newspaper and magazine designer, a guy called Mark Porter, I became fascinated by art direction and magazine and editorial design. As someone that hadn't studied those things when I went to art school, everything about this area was different. It was exciting, it was new. And the more inspired I got by magazine design, the faster that my enthusiasm for designing for the web bounced back. And I often wonder why so many web designers think that print is somehow old-fashioned or irrelevant to what we do. I'm losing my microphone. Technology. So I now buy magazines as regularly as I possibly can. And a week before last Christmas, I actually spent some time. I'm getting very confused with these two remotes. There we go. I was in a magazine store with some friends. It's sort of evangelizing about magazine and print design, and a friend of mine suggested, why don't you actually write a series about magazine and editorial design and what you find fascinating and how we can actually learn some lessons from those things and apply them to the web. And that conversation sparked the idea for a series on inspired design decisions, which I'm doing for Smashing Magazine, and every month I choose an art director or a designer or a publication or a magazine. Look at what makes that design distinctive, the lessons that we can learn from it, and then how we can use those lessons to make better work for the web. So I'm really happy to say that I'm inspired and I'm motivated again, and I really hope that this series is going to do the same thing for other people. And my bookcases are now absolutely chock full of magazine design inspiration. The collection is still growing. And this is a magazine that I picked up fairly recently. It's a magazine on printmaking called Pressing Matters. And when I read it, I was immediately transported back to art school. My wife will remember when my fingers were chopped up from using lino cutting tools. I just smelt like turpentine all the time, which I'm sure was very attractive. And Pressing Matters has this really simple but distinctive style, and it uses a very limited color palette. It often connects the color of elements to other elements which are found in nearby objects like illustrations or photographs. And the end result is very much like the thing that we want to accomplish on the web, which is a connected experience. And it uses layout patterns which produce this rhythm that flows throughout the magazine. And it uses differently sized layout modules which speed you past smaller pieces of information, pages that are packed with prints, and then the pace will slow you right down using larger panels so that you linger on the reproductions of the artwork. And what struck me about Pressing Matters in particular was how this magazine contained a variety of different layout styles which were demanded by the different types of content, but it still maintains a really high degree of consistency right the way throughout. And whereas so many people I hear recite this mantra that the web isn't print, there's so much that we can learn which will make our web designs better. So when I looked more closely at how these pages were constructed, what I discovered was a layered compound grid, which was comprised of 2 and 3 column grids overlaid on each other, which ran throughout the magazine. And a compound grid is a tool which was made famous by a typographer and graphic designer called Carl Gerstner. Anybody heard of Gerstner? Sush is nodding quietly in the background. Gerstner was a Swiss artist. Perhaps he was one of the most influential typographers. Trouble is, books about his work have been out of print for decades, so it's pretty unlikely that you're going to have seen his work firsthand, but it's still been incredibly influential. And by a really strange coincidence, I actually found out recently that Gerstner's ad agency created ads for Sinar, which is a Swiss large format camera maker that I actually worked for back in the 1990s. And Gerstner was one of the first designers to exploit the creative flexibility of using grids. And it's the compound grid which he created for this, which is Capital magazine, which became one of his best known creations. And given the potential variety of Capital's content, Gerstner needed a grid which would help him to lay out any type of content consistently and without any restrictions. So Gerstner created what he called a mobile grid, not the kind of mobile that you and I know about. And this grid is most likely what you'll find if you do a Google search for compound grid. If you're confused, so was I. So this compound grid designed for Capital, I've gone too wrong. It looks incredibly complex. So I'm going to break it down into its constituent parts. There are 58 rows and columns in a mobile grid. Gerstner started with just 1, so content in this single module fills the full width of the page. Then he divided up single module into 2 columns and rows, and using 2 columns in this way results in a reassuring symmetrical design. And that large module can also be divided into 3 columns and rows, and he's keeping the gutter and the margins the same, regardless of how many grid modules he uses. And by splitting that module into 4, those columns of content feel a lot more formal. The overall impression is that this design is a serious one. And when this full page module is divided into 5 columns and separated by 2 different spatial zones, this design feels a lot more technical. And with Gerstner's mobile grid, you can use each set of columns and rows separately, or you can turn them into a compound, either by overlaying or by stacking one on top of the other. So dividing the page up into 6 columns, 6 rows, enables this incredible variety of layout options. And the flexibility of a compound grid comes from the interplay of 2 or more grids. Is that right? So a compound grid is 2 or more grids of any type. That can be column grids, modular, symmetrical, or asymmetrical grids all on one page. And they can occupy these separate areas or they can overlap. And just as a simple thing, if you want to start playing with compound grids, you can start making a simple compound by overlaying 2 columns, one with 2 grids, one with 2 columns and one with 3 columns. And by using any number of equally sized columns and rows, this layout forms this consistent pattern. It's an even rhythm. We've talked about or heard about bootstrap a few times today. Nobody's talked about what I think is possibly the worst aspect of the bootstrap phenomenon, which is everybody using a 12-column symmetrical grid as the starting point for every design. If you think of each one of those columns as a beat, and you tap those out on your chair, what you don't get is a particularly entertaining rhythm. If you compare that to the rhythm that you'd get from a 2-1-1-2 type pattern, you can understand why using a compound grid can change both the visual result, but also your mental model as to how you use grids. So a compound grid of 2 or 3 columns creates a rhythmic pattern of 2-1-1-2. And then for an altogether different design, perhaps one which is using italicized type to suggest the movement in this car, you might stagger the paragraphs to create this dynamic diagonal which runs through the page. And changing that compound formation to combine 3 and 4 columns creates a completely different rhythmic pattern. This one is 3-1-2, 2-1-3. This same combination can make for a very different impression by combining column widths from both grids to inform, for example, the width of my running text. And that column perfectly matches the width of that portrait orientation car over on the right-hand side. And this time, I set the block of running text across 2 of those columns, and I've derived the width of those by combining column widths from both the 4 and the 5 column grid. And overlaying 4, is that the right one? Yeah. Overlaying 4 columns with 5 leads to this really unusual rhythmic pattern, 6-1-4, 3-4-1-6. Come to how we can implement those in a minute. So in this version of the design, this large image shows off the iconic shape of this E-type car, and then the solid block of text sits right underneath the wheels, and we get the width of that column from both the 4 column and the 6 column grid. And then this design literally places that E-type at the center of the action, and it wraps the text around both sides, which adds real energy and movement to the design. So I mostly use fraction units, FR units, as the pattern for my compound grids. And the result of a 2+3 compound is 4 columns where the outer 2 columns are double the width of the 2 inner columns. Whereas a combination of 3 and 4 column grids is going to result in 6 columns, and this rhythmic pattern of 3-1-2, 2-1-3. And a combination of 4 and 5 columns is going to result in 6 columns and a different rhythmic pattern. And then finally, combining 4 and 6 columns together creates 8 columns, and 2 of them are much, much narrower than the rest. And that's a rhythmic pattern there of 2, 1, 1, 2, 2, 1, 1, 2, which is actually a pattern I use a lot. So a compound grid might seem complex, but it's actually no more difficult to implement than any other 8 or 12 column grid. You know, I need ridiculously few HTML elements to actually implement this layout. And the CSS is even more compact. It's much more stable even than using other layout tools. So I want to tell you about an art director from the 1940s and 50s, a guy called Alexei Brodovich. And I began to study Brodovich when I became fascinated by editorial and magazine design. And I was drawn to just how precise Brodovich's work was. In particular, the way in which he brought photographs and text together. I also kind of appreciate his rebellious rejection of anything that he considered to be mediocre. And he was actually born in what is today Belarus, and he moved to Paris, where he actually beat Pablo Picasso to second place in a poster competition, amazingly. And then moved to the United States, where he taught, and he told his students to astonish me, which I just love that kind of attitude. And Harper's Bazaar became Brodovich's most well-known project, and to keep his designs fresh, he often commissioned work from European artists, people like Jean Cocteau and Marc Chagall and Man Ray. Not the kind of people you'd expect in a commercial fashion magazine. And his knowledge of photography gave his work this classic feel, and he often cropped photographs in really unexpected ways. He'd place them off-center. He'd sometimes bleed them outside the margins of the page to create these compositions which were full of energy and movement. And throughout his career at Harper's Bazaar and then beyond, he frequently used content in photographs or illustrations to inform the placement and the position and the shape of his text. And his color choices were also bold. He used large blocks of color for emphasis. And I just find his design process as fascinating as the finished work, because I often learn more about how someone thinks by looking at their work in progress than I do at what they ended up with. And Brodovich began designing his layouts by using sketches on paper. And then he arranged those spreads on the floor of his studio to create the pace of the magazine. Now, this might seem at first like a random collection, arrangement of pictures, but in fact, everyone was deliberately placed, and it fills this design with movement, and we can use the same technique today, even when we're designing flexible, responsive layouts. So for this first Brodovich-inspired design, I'm just going to scatter 4 differently sized images across the viewport, and I can arrange these images horizontally, vertically, even diagonally, depending on the screen dimensions. So to help me design a consistent experience across different screen sizes, I often form my own storyboard from a small series of sketches. So for smaller screens, I'm going to turn those images into a horizontally scrolling panel. And then on medium-sized screens, I'm going to scatter those images vertically to maintain the visual hierarchy in that portrait orientation. Now, to develop this design, I can use a combination of CSS Grid and Flexbox and CSS Transforms. And my markup is incredibly minimal and semantic. I've only got 3 structural elements for layout. And then to implement this design, I'm going to use that 4+6 compound grid that I showed you earlier. And then I can place each one of those elements onto the grid and then reposition them using a media query at the widest screen size. And then I can nudge or rotate those pictures to give them that scattered look which Brodovich inspired. Now, people have told me that designs like this are appropriate for editorial design. They might be, relevant to print, but not for products or websites. That isn't the case at all. This is an example. I used that same kind of scattered, pictured approach to bring this design for a new electric Vespa scooter to life. So I don't accept that this stuff is okay for print, but not for web. And Brodovich made the double-page spread his playground, and using this large canvas to carefully construct these compositions. So facing pages here allow Brodovich the possibility to contrast or to connect both sides of the spread. So this larger screen design splits that viewport into 2 columns, and it uses color and shape to reflect one side with the other. And all I need is 3 structural elements to implement this design. I need a heading, a main element, and an aside element. We've heard about the importance of using these HTML elements before. And then on smaller screens, all I need are just foundation styles, because the normal flow is going to take care of the order of the content. But then for medium-sized screens, I can apply grid properties to both of those main and aside elements so that I can then position the content on the grid. And then for larger screens, I can place those main and the aside elements onto the grid using a couple of named lines. So with a little imagination, with a little inspiration, we can make much more distinctive and engaging designs. Now, shapes add movement to a design. They help draw people in. They help connect an audience with a story or with a product, and they make this tighter connection between the visual and the written content. So, inspired by Brodovich for this next design, the shape of this running text reflects the shape in the header image, which is opposite. And I've seen very, very few examples of using CSS shapes which go beyond just using basic shapes. And I wonder sometimes whether that's because people have become so conscious of making designs that are, responsive, and maybe not understanding that, browsers not only, designs not only don't have to look the same across different browsers, but they don't necessarily have to look the same across different screen sizes either. We ought to be adapting our design while maintaining a consistent look and feel. So you can also use shapes to sculpt structural shapes from solid blocks of running text in the style of Brodovich. So the markup that I need to implement this design is similar to the previous example. It's just a header which contains a picture element and then a main element for the running text. Of course, designs like this aren't going to make sense at every screen width, but who said that websites need to look the same on every screen? Now, if you're using a browser that's, ancient, that potentially doesn't support CSS shapes, no problem. If we think about things from a progressive enhancement point of view, then all we're going to get is a standard straight vertical column of text. Nobody dies. And it's often, you need really little markup to develop dynamic and original layouts. You know, inside my main element, I've just got 2 SVG images, which I use to carve the shape of that running text. And then for larger screens, I can just apply a symmetrical 2-column grid to the body, place the header and the main elements using these named lines. And then I can rotate that header image clockwise and place the transform origin in the center so that it stays in the middle of my header. And then all that remains is me to float those SVG shape images left and right so that the running text runs between them and it mirrors the shape of that rotated image which was opposite. So you can see a ghost of those SVG images. And that's the end result. Now, tools like CSS Shapes give us countless opportunities to capture readers' attention, keep people engaged. And flexible designs, which include precisely positioned elements, they were really hard to do using CSS positioning and floats. But modern CSS techniques have made these designs much more straightforward to accomplish. And I hope that that's going to result in a new generation of much more inspired designs. So this next design is again inspired by a spread from Alexei Brodovich. It's from Portfolio magazine. And here he used this striking combination of black and white columns and a bold splash of color. Now, before implementing any design, again, I'm going to make a simple storyboard just to demonstrate how these elements are going to flow across a selection of screen sizes. And the footer, which either occupies the bottom on a small screen or the whole of the right-hand side on a large screen, because it needs a little bit more styling. So to accomplish the stripy background effect, I'm actually just going to use a CSS gradient rather than using any images. And then I can place and position each one of those images and use the clip path property to clip each one so that only a third of them is visible. And this is a really useful property. I'm surprised that we don't see this used more often online. These clipping paths can form any shape. They can form basic circles or ellipses or complex polygon shapes with any number of coordinates. So for this first image, I'm going to clip the right-hand side, which is only going to leave the 33% on the black area. I'm going to position the second image absolutely. I'm going to use a lower z-index value, which is going to send it to the bottom of my stacking order. And then for the third and final image, I'm going to clip the left-hand side, which is going to leave only that right portion visible. And then the design also includes an SVG circle, which I position over those images. And I can use a blend mode, a mix blend mode, which tints the color of the elements below it in the stacking order. And again, you can see how that thing can adapt across a selection of different screen sizes using Grid as appropriate. So since I discovered his work, I think Brodovich has probably been the most substantial influence on my design over the past couple of years. And his inability to accept anything which is mediocre, it's pushed me still to try to think beyond what's expected from a product or from a website design. So, I want to tell you about Bea Feitler. Now, Feitler was actually born in Rio de Janeiro in 1938. She worked on album covers and book designs and magazines and posters in Brazil, and then moved to Manhattan And in 1961, she was still only 25 years old. She became an art assistant and then one of the youngest and the first female co-art directors at Harper's Bazaar magazine. And despite her portfolio, which contains things like Richard Avedon's famous pink space helmet and John Lennon naked on the cover of Rolling Stone, she's actually been described as the pioneering female art director that you've never heard of. You know, on top of everything, she actually once kissed Andy Warhol as well. I suppose today's equivalent would be me kissing Hayden Pickering. What? Well, come up here, son. So one of my favourite quotes from Beer Feitler, which could just as easily apply or be describing of the web, is a magazine should flow. It should have a rhythm. You can't look at one page alone. You have to visualize what comes before and after. Good editorial design is all about creating a harmonic flow. I truly believe that that is as appropriate to the web as it was then. And like Alexei Brodovich, she fundamentally understood the dynamics of the double-page spread. And her bold designs are only a part of what make her life and her work fascinating. Even more important was how her work reflected changes in society in America during the 1960s and the bold choices that she made to influence it. In fact, she cast the first black model on the cover of a mainstream fashion magazine in 1965 and came under incredible criticism for it. I think it was like over a decade later until another black model was on the cover of Harper's Bazaar. Now, she's done so much to teach people who design for the web today, as much, I think, as she did to the magazine designers who followed her. I just hope in some small way with talks like this that I can help people fall in love with her work the way that I did. So this is one design that really stands out for me from Harper's Bazaar. I just love the way in which we have this kind of contrast and yet balance between both sides of the screen. I wanted to play with that. I wanted to see how we might adapt that for the web, but still keep it relevant for products and websites. So I want to try to find ways through all of these examples to illustrate that this is not just an academic design exercise. This is something that we can and should experiment with and apply to the work we do online. So to implement this first design, I'm just using a minimal set of structural elements, as small as I can. So we've got a header, a main, and an aside element which has the content. Now, this is where it starts to get interesting, because that landscape image fits really well on a larger size screen. But when you use it on a small screen, if you look at that on a phone, we completely lose the visual hierarchy of that particular page. So we need to change our image, use a wider format for screens which are wider than they are tall. So this media query, which can be used in style sheets as an alternative to a more conventional width query, or it can be used on things like picture elements. So in landscape orientation, I've got a symmetrical two-column grid and this linear gradient which fills the full height of the screen. And the result is this design which adapts the layout depending on whether the browser or the screen or the device is in landscape or in portrait orientation. Now, the Volkswagen Beetle, I don't know whether anyone's ever owned one. little car, big personality. So for this next example, which was inspired by Beer Feitler, I wanted my design to have some personality to match. So this large screen design uses this enormous picture of the Beatles' wheel to emphasize, contrast with, the smallness of that little car. And 3 structural elements make up the markup that I need to implement this design. Again, it's a header for the large wheel picture, a figure which contains the smaller image of the car, and then a main element for my running text. So before I get to the large screen, I just want to make sure that I maintain the contrast in scale, even on the smallest screens. You might notice there's a problem with some of that. You know, one problem that I've encountered a lot when developing flexible layouts is this kind of unintentional resizing of images. So with a fixed height on the header element and 100% width on the image, this giant wheel is going to get distorted. I'm going to give that Mini an unintentional flat, VW an unintentional flat tire. Fortunately, there's a way in which I can preserve the aspect ratio using the object fit property in CSS. So contain preserves an image aspect ratio while fitting inside the parent's containing box, so the image is contained inside the box, whereas cover preserves the aspect ratio, but this time it fills the whole box. So when this happens, parts of the image outside of that content box are going to be hidden. It's going to cover the content box. And then in this alternative version of the design, I can preserve the difference in scale between those 2 pictures at a variety of different screen sizes. And it's incredibly important to consider how we can maintain both a consistent experience and maintain visual hierarchy across different views of our same design. Now, Feitler's choice of bold colors was one of the hallmarks of her work. It attracted me immediately. So for this next inspired design, I contrast this deep red with a vibrant yellow, and then I reverse the colors on both sides of the design. So while this Feitler-inspired design is really big on color, it's also incredibly small on markup. I just need 2 structural elements. I just need a header, which contains a figure and a division, and a main element, which also contains a figure and a division. And then for medium-sized screens, I want the figure and the divisions inside both of those elements to occupy half the height of the viewport. So I'm going to add a symmetrical 2-column grid and a minimum height there of 100 VH, viewport height units. And then I can place those onto my symmetrical grid. Now, I want this design to fill the screen with color from edge to edge, so on larger screens, I'm going to apply that asymmetrical 2-column grid, which is going to extend the full height of my body element. And then I can reposition those elements for larger screens. So Feitler has just done so much to teach people who design for the web today, even without knowing it. Sadly, she died of cancer at the age of only 42. And there is only one book, retrospective book, available about Feitler's work. It was written by her nephew, and it was only published in Portuguese in Brazil in 2012. And it took me absolutely months to track down a copy. Eventually, I got one. It was the most expensive book that I've ever bought. 150 quid. My financial director is sitting at the back there. But do you know what? For the inspiration that I got and for the motivation and for just the rekindling of my interest in design, it was worth every penny. So if I want you to take away any kind of message from this talk today, is that there's so much more that we can do with web design, so many bold choices that we can make. We don't have to conform to somebody else's idea of what constitutes good design for a digital product or for a website. We can use instinct, we can use our gut to drive an idea forward. We don't have to research it or put it through a focus group or, test it to death. We can just make bold design choices and produce work which, is incredible. So, speaking of work which is slightly less incredible, I did write a book, and it would be rude of me not to promote it here. You can have a look at this at artdirectionfortheweb.com. There is also a video series which is available because we're all friends here. You can get 50% discount with the code Ace of Spades. And thank you very much for encouraging my bad behavior.